We talk global news a whole lot, but we barely talk about the news. So here we go. Oh, yeah. Lofi Poli Sci podcast coming at you. Michael Pickering here talking our famous question: what's going on in the world today? And every so often, it's important to check out just what the news cycle is looking like. A comparative analysis, a look at the metadata of what's going on in the world today. And what are metadata, you may be asking? Simple. It's data about data. So in our case, every day we talk about the data that are news stories and global events. That's our data points. And those global events are pieces of data, or in the singular, datum. Now you know. So on any given day, we talk about 5 pieces of data or 5 global news events. Today, we're talking about some descriptive statistics on how global news events are being covered. And what we're about to do is called content analysis. You see, I've chosen 10 news sites or news aggregators and want to see the first 10 stories in their world news sections. So 10 sites, 10 stories each, 100 global news stories in all, or 100 pieces of data. And the objective here is simply to see what everyone is talking about, to see which stories are getting the most coverage, to see just how diverse the news we read really is. And the 10 news sites or news aggregators are BBC World, AP World, Reuters World, NPR World, Fox World, CNN World, New York Times World, Washington Post World, Google News World, and Yahoo News World. And I searched all the websites on October 11th, 2021 at 5:20 p.m. And I cite the exact time and date and web browser format because websites aren't like printed newspapers. Websites constantly change due to the 24-hour news cycle, due to increased globalization and connectivity with the world, and the algorithm that these news publishers use. And the number of times a story gets covered isn't all about how important the news editors or journalists think it is, but it's also very much about how many clicks does that piece of news get. But we'll talk about that a bit more later. For now, let's jump into it. The top 10 most covered global news stories on this day and time based on the aforementioned news sites. And coming in at, and starting off with a tie for number 10, which really means in our case, a tie for number 11, with 3 news stories spread throughout our 10 news sites: Israel finding an ancient winery, and Burkina Faso, an ex-president goes on trial. Next is a 3-way tie for number 9, all coming in with 4 news stories each. News stories on the EU, the UN, and political scandal in Austria. Number 6, climate change, with 5 news stories from around the world. Now to our top 5, and coming in at number 5, Ethiopia and the war in the Tigray region starting again, with 6 stories. Number 4, Iraq, with 4 election stories and 3 ISIS stories for a combined 7 stories for Iraq. Number 3, Afghanistan, with 7 stories, all about the Taliban and company. Number 2, China and Taiwan, or China and miscellaneous. 6 stories were about Taiwan and China alone, and 5 other stories were about other events in China. So a combined 11 stories out of 100 were on China. And now, our number 1, and the most covered news story based on the 10 websites. I'll give you a 5 count to guess because I know you know exactly what this is. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The most covered story and all global news that we searched: fucking COVID-19. With 11 news stories from around the world all about COVID. Wouldn't you go figure that's the most covered news? But now we gotta do what we always do. Let's dig into it and see what these data really mean. And first off, what do we think? Any surprises here? I'll say only one of these really surprised me or popped off as a surprise when it comes to this top 10 list, and that's the Burkina Faso story. All these other ones, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, let's do a little math here. So we looked at 100 news stories across 10 platforms. And our top 10 stories account for 65% of all stories. And what's more, our top 5 stories alone, just 5 news stories out of 100 pieces of news, account for 42% of all coverage. 5 stories account for 42% of all coverage when there's 200 countries in the world and a ton of stories in each one of those countries. And I mean, really, between COVID and China stories, that's 22% of all news, meaning just over 1 in 5 stories are about either COVID or China. Meaning, if you were to take all these stories and write them down on different pieces of paper, fold them, put them into a hat, mix them up, and you were to pull random out of the 100 news stories, you'd have a 1 in 5 chance of pulling a story on either China or COVID. And that's really good odds. And is that really a good thing about your news? Let's keep going. And now let's think about how much we really can draw from this content analysis, and if this list even matters at all. Firstly, we can't draw too much, okay? Other than these stories on this day and this time were trending on these 10 news publishers' web browser platforms. I mean, we can say that more news coverage is going on towards these news stories today. Yeah. And we can say a lot of other things are getting buried that aren't even being talked about. Sure. We can also say that if this is happening today, then surely it's going to be happening on other days too? Question mark? And our answer is most certainly so. If we were to do a long-term content analysis on these 10 news sites, let's say over a 6-month time period, we'd likely see some other trends as well about which countries get way more coverage than others in the world news sections. And while I'm not going to do that right now, maybe later though, but I can tell you, from podcasting Lofi Poli Sci for over a year and a half, and from daily reading of many different sites, I can tell you who those countries are that get more coverage than others. Really easy like too. So in North America, you have US and Mexico. Latin America and Caribbean, Cuba, Haiti, Brazil, and Colombia. Eastern Asia, it's Japan, China, Taiwan, South Korea, North Korea, Thailand. Go moving more Central Asia, it's India, and you keep moving to the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Israel. Europe, it's the UK, France, Germany, and Russia. Africa, it's Nigeria, South Africa, and to a lesser extent, Madagascar. And that's about it. 25 countries dominate global news coverage. That's 25 out of 200 countries in the world. That's only 12.5% of the nations of the world that we hear, read, or watch news on. And that, my friends, is not getting a glimpse of what's going on in the world today. Now, if you're a regular listener to us, you may say that I'm guilty of talking about those same countries a good bit. And I'd say sure, along with a lot of other countries that most people consider random pieces of news. But you see, there's nothing random about what goes on in one country. Whether it's the Philippines having an ex-dictator's son running for president, or Chile rewriting their constitution, or Senegal building Akon City, or Ethiopia and the damming of the Nile and how that affects Sudan and Egypt, or Georgia and Azerbaijan going to war for 6 weeks last year and still having major issues today. None of that is random. They are all dots, pieces of data, that only when you start connecting all of those dots, well then, you truly get a picture of the world. But we don't get that kind of variety from our news organizations, at least not one news organization by itself. So, what does it mean about the variety of global news we read, potentially? It means that, generally speaking, reading just one news site, or using just one news app, or just clicking the world section or the politics section, you're not even getting a glimpse, not even a close glimpse, of what's going on in the world today. You're getting a brief snapshot of what journalists and news editors feel like writing about and think is important on that day, mixed with what readers are clicking on. And that's it. It's the logarithm matched up with news editing rooms. And that effect we call agenda setting, mixed in with a bit of echo chambering. Well, that's the kind of thing that Lofi Poli Sci was made just to fight against. A year and a half ago, we were all tired of hearing the same thing from the same people no matter where we clicked and no matter what we read or watched or listened to. We said no more. We want to really know what's happening. And we decided to do something about it. And one day, I think I will do that content analysis on all the stories we've covered here and see where our own bias lies and use that to get better, to push harder, to really show you more than just a snapshot. But hey, we'll save that one for another day. Because as of today, while we're only on episode 46, that's 46 out of season 4, our running total, today makes episode 362. So yeah, that's a fair amount of data to comb through, but a future list for sure. And that, my friends, is this Tuesday's Top 10 list. And do you have your own ideas for Top 10 lists? Send them on in. Come on now. And do you have some good news or shout-outs you want to make? Let us know. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Peace and well-being to all my human beings out there. Much love and always the best. Pickering, signing off.